How many of you have been enjoying the afterburns when we put them on and do them after the teachings? Are you enjoying those? Okay, I know a lot of the people online are enjoying those. So this is the time that this is what we call the afterburn, which is after the teaching. We open up for questions and comments regarding what was just taught. This is something that I think is relatively unique. A lot of ministries don't do this. But we think, at least I've always thought it was important, because in a sort of selfish way, I always wanted to do this to make sure that you actually received what I said the way I meant it. And so I felt like I needed to open up the floor for questions just to make sure, did you understand what I was saying in the way I meant it? So we've done this always since we started ministry. We've always had this time. This is only recent that we started recording it. And so if you have a comment or question, David's going to come around with the mic. If you're on the live stream, Robert will make note of it. And so who wants to go first?
So you brought up Romans chapter 2, and this has always been kind of a question to me, that Romans 2:13, he talks about how someone will be justified by what they do, the doing of the law justifies them. And then the very next chapter in verse 20, it looks like he's saying just something contradictory to that. Can you look at that and answer that?
Well, between verse 2 and the next place where you saw that, he had a break, and then he was off his meds.
Oh, to get saved then?
Yeah, no, he was off his medication, and so he got confused. No.
I wondered.
Look, Paul's letters are the most abundantly available to people to be doing whatever they do to them. The translations have been done. So we're talking about, where was the okay, so when we're looking at chapter 3, it says, therefore by the works of Torah, no flesh shall be declared right before him, for by Torah is the knowledge of sin. Okay, so remember, this kind of goes back to what was going on in Isaiah. I mean, they were doing Torah, but there was more to it than just this mechanical stuff. So you can't just say, well, you have to let me in because I kept the Sabbath and I kept the feast and I ate right and all that kind of stuff. It's not a checklist. The heart and the attitude are just as important as the mechanics of it. So he's saying, look, simply by doing this, the works is not going to have you, justified in Yahweh's eyes, because look at what happened to Isaiah. Isaiah's having the same problem. We read that in verse 2. In verse 2, he's saying, look, these are people that seek after me. They do what I say for the most part, but there's so much that they're not doing. And they're not doing it with the right attitude and with the right heart, and they're not trusting in me. So I think that this actually is consistent with what we're seeing in Isaiah. But the thing is, again, when you're reading Paul, you can't just go by the translation, because sometimes it's using the word law. In this translation, they'll put the word Torah in. Sometimes the word Torah is being put in where it shouldn't be. Because when it talks about the law of sin and death, there's not a Torah of sin and death. That's the law of man. That's the fleshly law that's in our own members. And so these things get very confused in Paul's writings. But again, we have to think about, in the full context, we have to kind of go back and say, what is Paul really talking about and the point he's trying to make? If you cherry pick a verse, now I'm not going to be able to just quickly jump out and try to remember all of Romans chapter 3 into 2 and remember the difference here, but I can easily see that that verse is trying to tell you that mechanics is not going to do it for you. It's not saying, remember what I said earlier, that mechanics are wrong or not necessary, but they're not enough. It's not an either or, it's a both. Same exact thing I was saying in my interpretation from Jeremiah and Isaiah. Does that make sense? Okay? So it's not an either or, it's a both. And so what we're trying to understand is that there is more than just this. Now, by the way, he says, now apart from the Torah, a righteousness of Elohim has been revealed, being witnessed by the Torah and the prophets. And the righteousness of Elohim is through belief in Yeshua Messiah to all and on all who believe, for there is no difference. And by the way, this is telling you that there is a need for something to deal with the sin. This is dealing with, just because you keep the Torah doesn't mean you haven't made mistakes. There's no need for Messiah. He said the prophets witnessed this. He's trying to make a case for why we need Yeshua in addition to just the Torah. Follow that logic. He says, look, therefore by works of Torah no flesh shall be declared right. What does that mean? He says, look, you've sinned, you deserve death. But it has been revealed that apart from just the Torah itself, there is a righteousness of Elohim that's been revealed. In other words, that's when you're going to need the imputed righteousness of Yeshua to overcome that penalty of death. He said the prophets talked about it too. Am I making sense here? So now, when that's there, he says, and the righteousness of Elohim is through belief in Yeshua, Messiah to all and on all who believe, for there is no difference. For all have sinned and fall short of the esteem of Elohim. Okay, being declared right without paying by his favor through the redemption which is of Yeshua. So in other words, you get to keep Torah, believe in Yeshua, and come under the blood, etc., and not have to pay the penalty of death. But it's not separating that one is separate from the other. He's saying this wasn't enough. Nowhere in here does he say it was wrong, bad, or unnecessary. He says this Torah observant thing doesn't get it done by itself. If it did, we'd all be sitting in a Jewish synagogue right now instead of here. Okay? The question came from Kirk was that because we can't do it perfectly? It's not because we can't do it perfectly, it's because he knows we won't. And because we won't, because we have all this other stuff, because we can. I think it's possible to do everything perfectly, except that we have our ways that seem right to us and our own hearts and lusts. See, that's the problem. The heart is desperately sick and it's an enmity to Yahweh, etc. It's an enemy of Yahweh. And so it's not that we can't keep it. He knows we won't. And because we don't, the sin penalty is death, and we've earned it. And what he's saying here in verse 24 is that, but because of Yeshua into this mix, you don't have to necessarily end up having to pay that penalty. Because look at verse 25, whom Elohim set forth as an atonement through belief in his blood to demonstrate his righteousness, because in his tolerance Elohim had passed over the sins that had been taken place before. Which is why I told everybody that his death and burial, let's go back to this, his death was not part of the sacrificial system. It is more connected to the passing over covering of the blood of Exodus when they came out of Egypt. How the blood marked people to be passed over in terms of death. And so Paul is connecting that here. I agree with him 100%. But let's not disconnect, because remember, you're coming from a totally dispensational mindset, which likes to take things that go together and separate them. And actually, Christianity likes to take things that don't go together and put them together. So they synergize things that don't belong together and they separate things that do go together. Nowhere here is Paul saying that the works of the law are useless to you because now we have Yeshua. No, he's saying is that the works of the law never were enough, but you needed Yeshua. So hopefully that makes more sense. Did I answer your question? Okay, good. Good question. You know, I love those Paul challenging questions. Especially when you're, by the way, if you want this job, realize you have to handle Paul questions without a net. In other words, on the fly. So, and listen, Paul says a lot of things. It's not always clear what he was trying to say. And it's going to take running in there, and hopefully the words are there and the Ruach gives you a quick answer, because it's tough. Because he really does sound like he's nuts. Because he doesn't just seem to contradict the Torah, he seems to contradict himself. Sometimes within the same paragraph or within 3 or 4 verses. Because he'll say, the law is no good, the law is no good. Am I saying the law is no good? God forbid. What? Well, because he wasn't saying what we think he was saying there. And so he sounds like he's crazy. And so that gets tough. Daweed, go ahead.
I think what he was trying to say is not necessarily that the law was bad, but because of the law, because there is a standard for what's right and what's wrong, that we as human beings, not because we can't, because Deuteronomy 30 says we can, but the point is that we don't, like you said, and therefore, because of that sin, that is the transgression of the law, that's why we need the imputed righteousness of Yeshua eventually.
To cover that.
Yeah, but we have to get to the gate through doing our best to do the Torah first.
Right, so it all goes back, well, look, follow this real quickly here. We'll go back just real quickly. It says, verse 20, therefore by works of Torah no flesh shall be declared right. Why? For all, verse 23, have sinned and fallen short. Okay? That's why. So it's not enough. So we need to bring in the redemption through Yeshua that covers. That's the simplicity of what he's trying to say there. The Jewish community he's talking to is trying to say, we don't need Yeshua. And he's saying, no, you do. Because Torah doesn't fix this problem. You still need to do and demonstrate that it's in your heart, Deuteronomy 8:2, to keep the commandments. But since you're not going to, on a consistent basis, you're going to mess up and sin and break the law, then we need something to cover, because the penalty of sin is death. And so that's all Paul's trying to say here in a Pauline way, which makes it very confusing for the normal person. Okay? But I think that you can start to see the flow there. He's simply trying to say that the Torah doesn't do everything. But it's nowhere in there hinted that it's not important for what it does. It shows your desire to keep the covenant, which is, I will do what you say. So the way you treat Torah is the covenant itself. But since you will break the covenant from time to time because of fleshly desires and all these distractions, you need Yeshua. If we never messed this up, there would have never been a need for Yeshua. We need him because we, and that's why we have to really take it and understand how seriously that part that we play in it. We fell short. We deserve to die. It says here that we have been declared right without paying. How are we declared right? Because Yeshua paid that price if you get to the door. And that's the vision. Remember, I laid that vision out of walking on a path covered by Yeshua's blood. And as long as you're walking on that path, you are protected and safe. That path leads to the door. I'm going to make this a real short version of it. Leads to the door to the kingdom. The door is locked. Your righteousness, your walking of Torah got you to the door. But occasionally you stepped off the path on the way. And when you did teshuvah, you got back on the path and kept walking. Your walking got you there, though. But guess what? That's Romans chapter 3. All Torah did was get you to the door. That's big, by the way, because without it, you wouldn't have got to the door. But now at the door, you realize you're stained, and you can't go through the door in a stained condition. All that sin, you've been washed clean, but you're stained. In other words, I could take a garment, pour something that stains on it, wash it, it's clean, but it's still stained. And so every time you sin, you can be washed clean, but you're still stained. The only thing that can get you unstained is his blood. And so that's what then gets added to you, verse 24 of this, where it says being declared right without paying. At this point, at the gate to go in, you've done your part. His part now gets added to you, the part you couldn't do. Then the door unlocks. But guess what? If you didn't walk it, you never get to the door. Everything he did is useless to you. He did it, but it's of no benefit to you. If you just go off doing anything you want to do and ignore all the things that he says to do and you're told to do, you made the blood of no accord, at least as far as you're concerned. It'll benefit all the other people, though, the ones that decided to put in that effort. What Paul was talking about in chapter 2, where you're going to be rendering according to your works, the things that you do, your choices. Now, of course, he's telling you that in doing those works, it has to be also done in belief and understanding of Yeshua.
Yeah.
See, I knew as soon as I started talking about Paul, we were going to light the fire. Thanks, Marty. See, everybody was fine till you did that.
So Sherry L. asked, she lives in California where a majority of the people think those that work for a living owe the lazy a living. How do you deal with Isaiah 58 when you see people who have strong backs yet choose not to work and begging and living off entitlements? And seems like that would be enabling.
Well, first of all, you are correct in everything you said, but you have to realize it's not your problem. Okay, Yahweh's dealing with it. Yahweh will deal with it. Well, the government here has to deal with it, and if they deal with it badly, as they have been, we have to you need to make sure you're not the one who's able-bodied if you're able-bodied who's laying back and doing nothing. All you can do is take care of you and those who are in your sphere of influence. Family members, children, that kind of thing. Someone you may have some authority over, or if you're a congregational leader, to encourage the congregation. But there's always going to be those that take advantage of the system. The problem is that what seems right in their head is going to lead to death. It's not going to get them where they're going to need to go. Okay, what we need to do is not let it bother us. I know we have a problem with seeing what looks like and probably is injustice. Well, it's wrong. It's not fair that all these people working hard and we got to pay for these lazy bones. Okay, you're right. So what? You want to sound like the workers that came into work all day and the guys who came in the last minute got paid the same? Do you want to sound like those guys? I don't want to sound like those guys. It doesn't sound like those guys were in good standing with what they were saying. Well, how come they get paid the same? But he said, well, didn't you get paid what I told you get paid? Well, yeah. All right, so be quiet. Stop worrying so much about everybody else. They got a plank in your own eye, work on it. Okay? I know it bothers you. Listen, it irritates everybody to watch what they see happening. It's injustice. Minimize the irritation by giving it to who gets it properly, which is the Creator. It's not your problem, it's His problem. He's allowed it for a reason. Part of it is so that you can see the system that the world has put in place doesn't work because it allows these abuses to take place. And what the abuse is, when I say it is abuse to allow a person to lay around lazy, it destroys their character, destroys their self-esteem, it destroys them as a person. So it's abuse, really, to let people lay sideways at the public trough and just do nothing. That's abuse. It's abusive to their children. It's abusive to them. It's abusive generationally. And so Yahweh wants you to see that so that you won't do that. So you say, I'm going to do what I need to do. But don't feel guilty like you're somehow contributing to the problem because your income is supporting those who are doing nothing. Even if your income didn't, the government just print up their own money and just give it to people anyway. Next question.
From Nancy. When you describe Yahweh as setting out the boundaries of protection, if we remain within His boundaries, is that the same as being and staying inside the camp?
Yes.
And this is, I'm going to read two people's questions because they kind of go together. Earl Lee said, would you clarify spending an hour in prayer, the mindset and the heart and so on? And Don Taylor also asked, there's a movie out there about War Room, and she's asking if that's the kind of prayer or praying, is that the kind of prayer we should be doing or praying for an hour? That kind of prayer being a literal room that we go into and pray for an hour?
No, I mean, you just need to go someplace where you're going to be not distracted. Some of you have, quiet spaces out, in the backyard behind your house or in the front yard or a place in your house. Just someplace where you can have quiet time. You can go out to a public park. It doesn't matter. Just go somewhere away from everybody where you can have quiet time. Some of you like the outdoors more than the indoors. Some of you like the indoors more than the outdoors. It doesn't matter. Just go someplace quiet. There is going to be an element that we're missing that needs to be integrated in, and we're going to integrate it little by little as we can, of East meets West. Eastern philosophy, Eastern belief systems have a huge part of their understanding is meditation, the idea of being quiet and sitting still. Well, our belief came out of the Middle East. It's more East than West. But because we're so anti-East, we've totally disconnected anything from the idea of how do you sit still. And it doesn't mean that you're saying any particular sound and sitting in a lotus position and going om or something. It simply means we've lost the ability to be quiet and let our brain sort through things, let the Spirit work with us, and let our vertical connection evolve and develop. Because we don't know how to be quiet. And that's something that's the primary focus of the Eastern philosophies is sitting and being quiet. And that is not completely disconnected when you see Yeshua doing this all the time. He didn't go to a Buddhist temple. He went off on his own and found a place to be quiet and vertically connect. And not have to, see, well, we're always thinking in a Western mindset of being active. Praying means I'm doing something. Why? Why does it mean that? Well, because that's what I've always seen in the Western societies that I've always lived in Western civilization, is that praying means that we're speaking and our mouth is moving and we're doing things. Okay? So we don't understand being still, but then, but being still seems very, Eastern philosophy. every pagan religion and the proper belief have certain elements in common. They meet, we meet. They have buildings they go to, we have buildings we go to. I mean, there's some things that are in common and have nothing to do with being pagan or not. Scripture shows something Yeshua does that we don't do. He went off a lot, as was his custom and as was his habit, and went alone by himself to pray. And he would go for hours. And if you pray for hours, we'd be bored out of our minds in minutes. Forget about hours. And so there needs to be a proper integration of something that got separated apart that was always a part of what was going on in the source, which was the East. But the Middle East source, meaning when Torah was given, there was always this element of being able to get and be quiet. We don't read much about it in the Tanakh. But we read a lot about it in the New Testament. We read Yeshua doing it. Okay? And so there are Jewish traditions that talk about that element. All right, so we can bring those in because they help us understand better what Yeshua was doing. But let's understand, just because it seems similar to something doesn't mean that if they do it, we can't do it. Well, there's a lot of copycatting going on back and forth. And so we have prayers, they have prayers. We meet, they meet. You know what I'm saying? I mean, so what? So that means that they can't do it because we're doing it and it's right, or we can't do it because they're doing it and it's right, or maybe we're both right to do some of these things. Now, some of these things are completely wrong, that how they worship and how they observe, that's a whole different thing. So being quiet doesn't necessarily mean you have to use some of the elements that they use. How about just going from someplace, finding someplace to sit down and be quiet? Or just walk, just kind of wandering in a little space, just kind of being quiet. The more you can sit still, the more you'll learn something discipline-wise, and you'll realize how hyper-stimulated we are, and we can't even just sit still. Even those of you that are not ADD or ADHD, I think we'll all become that way if you try to sit still for more than 15 minutes and there's nothing else to do, and you sit there going, what do I do now? What else you got?
From Rachel Johnson, could you please expand more on the man who trusts still having the drought around him? Is this the same as the time, chance, place thing?
Well, it could be just time and chance, but it also could be the fact that Abba is allowing things to come in your life to see what you do. He may allow a real drought to come in your life. He's not going to let you starve. He's not going to let you go thirsty. Look, it's like when Israel came out of Egypt and they were hungry. Oh, he let them get hungry. They weren't starving, but he let them get hungry. They weren't dying of thirst, but he let them get thirsty. And then after he showed them that he would provide for them, he still let them get hungry and thirsty, and they still whined and complained, not trusting that he would provide. And so it's really more about that things, whether it's time and chance or his allowing it or causing it on purpose, is to see how you respond. Trials are to see, it's like I tell you all the time, it's like a pop quiz. He wants to see how you respond to the trial to see where you're at in your growth. What else you got?
From Rick Berry. Many of us have read or watched The Pilgrim's Progress at some point, which stresses obeying instruction. Could you comment on that?
First, I can't because I didn't understand what you said. And second of all, I think it's asking me about something I don't know anything about.
Okay. It's a book, Pilgrim's Progress. You don't know?
Don't know anything about it. All right, so that's what I figured. Okay. So no to both. No, I couldn't understand you, and no, I don't know anything about that.